All right, good evening and afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Bethany Hines. I'm the Director of Operations and Strategic Projects for National Programs here at Best Friends. Tonight, we are doing the first of what's going to be a three-part town hall series, 2020, the times they are changing. There's no doubt that COVID has impacted literally everything in everyone's lives, and animal welfare is not an exception to that. But one thing I think we've all learned from this pandemic is our ability to react quickly, to change, to work through the challenges and fears associated with change. And that theme is what we're going to embrace over the three parts of this town hall series. Before I dive in and get started, I do want to review some quick housekeeping with everyone. As you know, this is a Zoom call, but don't worry, unlike most Zoom calls, you can't accidentally unmute yourself. On our end, we will keep everyone muted and your cameras will be turned off, so no worries there. However, the intent of these town halls is really to be a discussion, not just among the moderator and panelists, but really with the audience. And so how we would like you to participate is using the question and answer box. It should be at the bottom navigation on your screen. Go ahead and you can type questions in throughout the presentation. We're going to go through a discussion first, and then we've reserved a bunch of time at the end of the call to read your guys' questions. So please, please, please type questions in throughout, and we will get to those at the end. Additionally, we are recording this call, and so today's call and all the resources that we share with you during the call will be available tomorrow afternoon on network.bestfriends.org. If you go to our town hall section, you'll be able to, again, view this recording and access all of the resources. All right, so now that housekeeping's out of the way, we're going to go ahead and dive into our discussion for tonight. And it is a little bit of a heavy one. We're talking about self-awareness and kind of transformational change, which isn't easy for anyone. And so our panel tonight is a nice diverse panel of Best Friends staff members who all have very different backgrounds in animal welfare before coming to Best Friends. And so we'll be able to hear about their backgrounds and how they navigated through self-awareness and change, specifically as it pertains to programmatic operations that can sometimes bring roadblocks to life-saving. And so first up tonight, we've got Stacy Rogers. She's our Midwest Regional Director. Hi, Stacy, thanks so much for joining. Next, we have Destiney Haney. She is our Community Cat Programs Manager. Hey, Destiney. And then we have Kristan McCormick. And Kristan is our Transport and Embed Coordinator, but she actually wears several hats with us in the organization, so works across programs. Thank you so much, ladies, for joining tonight. Stacy, I'm going to get started with you. If you can give us just a little bit of background about how you came to work in animal welfare.
So I walked into my very first visit to a humane society in July of 2001 because I wanted to adopt a cat. And within a couple months, I was actually an employee. I was hired on as a part-time animal care staff, doing everything from cleaning to adoptions to medical, just depending on the day, because we were a small shelter in a smaller community. We were an open admission shelter. We had a few municipal contracts, and we took in about 5,000 animals a year. At that point in the early 2000s, our save rate was 40%, or just below that. I graduated from college. I decided to stay on, and I took on every role from volunteer manager to public relations, marketing, fundraising. I took a little bit of a hiatus and worked a little bit in human services, and came back and realized I really was an animal welfare lifer. So I came back to the shelter in 2010 and moved from outreach manager into the executive director role. And I stayed in that role for just about 5 years before I moved on to Best Friends. During that time, we started some managed intake and dropped our annual intake to about 3,000 animals a year, and our save rate climbed from those numbers in the 30s up to 94% when I left. You're still muted, Bethany.
Thank you. Sorry, I try to mute myself when I'm not talking just because I got some fans going. I don't want there to be background noise. Thanks for letting me know. So when you were there, kind of either initially or even when you still returned, what were some of the roadblocks you started to see occurring at the shelter as it pertained to life saving?
I'd say what roadblocks weren't present is kind of the better question, because we had so many roadblocks. In the very early days, even prior to an animal getting on our adoption floor, we were not allowed to place pit bull type dogs. We had a rule that we couldn't place any kittens under 2 pounds into foster care. And we also had a really black and white behavioral assessment. And then if the animals passed all of those things to go up for adoption, we still had a very tight rein on our adoption policies. We had landlord checks and veterinary checks. Once we started to loosen up things later on, like in the 2010, 2011, we still were doing home visits and background checks for our adopters if they were looking at a pit bull type dog. We were still doing a lot of those things, but we were just doing it in a little more of a gray area. What we didn't realize was that when we were asking all of those questions and we were being so strict and we were so sure that we were doing the right thing to place animals in the very best homes, we were only finding the perfect home for like 30% of the animals that were coming through our doors, while 70% of those animals were dying because we were keeping such a tight grip on making sure that we thought the animals were safe when they left our building, rather than making sure they were safe and alive when they were leaving our building.
There we go, sorry. And I think that it's our natural instinct, right? So in animal welfare, I'm sure all of us on the call and everyone who's a part of our audience this evening have had those stories and seen those moments in time where there are terrible things that can happen, can happen to cats and dogs that come through our care. And it's really hard to shake ourselves from those. Those stories stick with us. And they create a lens. It's almost like we're wearing like worst case scenario goggles, right? So like we're so worried about what could happen because we've seen it. We put ourselves in a position where we're denying life saving because of some super small chance that an animal could end up with the wrong family. When in reality, we all know that 99.99% of all of the families that come to our organizations looking to adopt are families that are looking to share their space in their home and love an animal. So totally get where you're coming from with that. So when did things kind of start to change? Like what were some of your first aha moments when you started to realize that we are protecting our animals literally to death?
We made a few small incremental changes over the years, making things a little bit more gray. And by like 2010, 2011, our save rate was in the 70s. And we thought we were doing really well at that point because we were convinced that because we were open admission, no kill was not an option for us. We thought, we're taking in anything that comes to the door. So this is really probably as good as it's going to get. And then in 2012, we went to the Best Friends Conference and we sat through all the sessions. And afterwards, we decided to drive up to the Best Friends Sanctuary and take like a little day trip and spend the night. And on the drive up there, we said, as much as I'm somebody who never wants to be wrong, we realized everything we were doing was wrong. It was not that being no kill was unattainable. It was that our policies were holding us back from getting there. So on the drive up, we talked about a lot of the animals that died in our care that we really could have placed if we wouldn't have had those policies in place. If we would have allowed a pit bull type dog to be adopted out of our county, if we would have thought differently about somebody who wanted a semi-indoor, semi-outdoor dog or placed barn cats. So as we made that drive and on the plane ride back to Indiana, we really set out our plan for this is what we're going to come back and this is what we're going to do. And I think really the biggest aha moment, and I wish I remembered what speaker said it, was that they said the most dangerous place for a dog is in your shelter. And that was really where we realized, like, yeah, we are the ones holding them back. So we came back, we removed all of our pit bull type dog adoption requirements. We started a barn cat program. We ended landlord checks. We ended vet checks. And that was really landlord checks, especially because we're in a college community. So there's a lot of transient housing, and we were concerned that animals were going to start coming back if we weren't calling every landlord. And we realized as we tracked our results that didn't happen. So we made all of those changes immediately. And then the following summer in 2013, we did the Rachel Ray $100,000 challenge and really ramped up our adoption promotions. And with that, we reached no kill by 2015.
Yeah, I was with an organization at the same time as that challenge. And I know we've talked about this before with one of our colleagues, McKenna. She was also in an organization participating in the challenge. And I feel like we all landed on, we got second place. So we probably all got second place in a different category, but that sort of national campaign was so successful because it took, at least here's 3 examples of organizations that, because they were participating in that, it forced them to take a hard look at like, how accessible are our animals? Like really, how accessible are they to our community? Because we have a community full of families and full of homes that want to save the pets in our care. So what roadblocks are we putting up to preventing that from happening? And so I know that the organization I was with, we made some substantial changes as a result of that, and that participating in that event back in 2013 was kind of the catalyst for that. And that was, it led to some really good change. Your aha moment like triggered a similar story for me. So I had got my start in central Illinois, or downstate Illinois. I mean, I guess anything south of I-80 is considered downstate Illinois, and an organization. And we were your standard brick and mortar humane society, medium-sized, limited admissions. So we chose who we took into our organization. But I volunteered with a TNR organization locally and mainly fostered kittens for them. And so when I left that role and went to a new role in Wisconsin, I was in a leadership position. And on my first day, I walked in and we had 4 cats that were in our isolation room that had been there for 3 weeks. And I'm like, what's up with these cats? Like, why have they been here for so long? And someone said, oh, those are feral cats. We don't know what to do with them. And I was like, oh, well, they're feral cats. You know, they're not, these cats can't live inside. We can't adopt them out. You know, the best thing that we can do for them is to end their life, which is what we did. And it didn't click to me at the time. I had volunteered with a TNR organization, but then I saw 4 community cats in my shelter, and I thought the solution was to kill them. Like I thought that ending their life was the best solution for them. A couple months into that role, I was fortunate enough to go to a conference, and I heard Bonnie Brown speak at the time, and she talked about community cats in a more holistic sense, that just because they landed in your shelter doesn't mean they can't go back to where they came from. And it was like that light bulb moment of wow, like that makes more sense than what I was doing. And so when you said that, it kind of sparked that memory for me. And I think it's like just exposure to those different scenarios and hearing different people talk about their stories makes you realize some things about your own programs. So thank you for sharing that. Since joining Best Friends, have you had any other, like, because you were in that role, like you said, for a long time, left, came back to that role, and then joined Best Friends. Were there any kind of further aha moments since you've been in your new role now for a couple of years?
I think one of the things that really I just hadn't thought about previously was we had gotten on board, we were doing barn cats and a little bit of TNR as our local ordinances changed. But my thought up until that point had really been that community cat programs were meant for those cats that ended up in the shelter that weren't friendly enough for adoption. If they came in and we didn't have an avenue to get them into a home, then we would place them into a barn home or back where they came from if that was possible with our ordinances. And I realized with Best Friends then that it was possible to return all of your stray cats to field, and you could return the friendly cats and the friendly younger kittens, and that was really ideal for the cats, is to keep them out in the community where they belong. So I think that's something that kind of one of those newer ideas that's just starting to get some traction, and still sometimes groups have to have kind of that aha moment of why are we filling up our shelter with friendly cats when they had a home in their own community before they got here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, to your point, something that's a newer idea, and a lot of groups still struggle with it, especially groups that have been doing TNR for ages. Like that group I volunteered with back in the early 2000s, like that was our MO. If it was a kitten like under 6 months old, we were pulling it out of colonies, regardless of its temperament. Period. If it was any sort of friendly cat or looked at you sideways enough to say, ooh, I might be friendly, like we had to save those cats from their outside world. And the reality is they're happy and they're healthy. And I know, Destiney, you're going to talk more about that too. But I definitely think that these aha moments will kind of continue to happen regardless of what role we're in, just because things are always changing and evolving. Awesome. Thank you, Stacy. Destiney, I'll get you started with the same question. Can you talk a little bit about how you came into your work in animal welfare?
Yeah, so I grew up in Missouri, and I've always had my hands in animals in some way, shape, or form, pet sitting, whatever it might be. And then I moved to Los Angeles, and I was living in a little apartment and had a pregnant mom cat who would sit on my porch every night when I came home from work, and I wasn't sure what to do about her. And I somehow came across a rescuer out in Los Angeles who was willing to help me TNR her. And that kind of got me immersed into this whole Los Angeles rescue scene. And I started working at her sanctuary. She ran a rescue. And we were a smaller organization, and we primarily focused on special needs cats. So we had FIV cats, FELV cats, a lot of seniors, a lot of cats with behavioral issues. And you know, those cats aren't necessarily the easy adoptions. They didn't have any adoption program when I started there, and I was really excited because I was like, oh, somebody's going to want to adopt them. So I had these really great ideas. And after managing at the shelter for 5 days out of the week, on Saturdays, I went to Petco and set up and did adoptions. And then on Sunday, I did what I called home deliveries for those cats to their new home. And did that for several years until about 2010 when I started working with Best Friends. So it's very exciting.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So when you started with that organization, you said they didn't have an adoption program?
They didn't have anything in place. They had, I think, 3 of their 60 cats that were on Pet Finder at the time, and that was it. And it was pictures of them when they were much younger than they were at the age that they were in the facility. So I was really excited to try to get exposure for the cats. And like I say, kind of went in, you know, wide-eyed and all excited, but didn't really know where to begin. And because we had special needs cats, for the most part, there was definitely a sense that we needed to be very selective on who adopted those animals. Some of the cats were going to have medical costs for the rest of their lives. Some of them were going to have some severe behavior issues where we felt like they needed to be an only cat. So when I was creating the process, I decided the best option was to go to other organizations who already had programs. And with their permission, I plagiarized their adoption applications. And I remember being extremely proud of myself when I was able to take their 3 and sometimes 4-page long adoption applications and make it 2 pages because nobody wants to deal with staples. And I did that not by making less questions, but by making smaller font and wider margins. And had every question you could think of, from the, you know, classic, do you rent or do you own, which is pretty much renting for everybody in Los Angeles. But I also remember I had, do you have a pool? Which we were a cat only rescue. And looking back at that, it's completely ridiculous because if anybody even suggested that we're going to have indoor outdoor cats, they wouldn't have been adopted to anyway. So asking them about a pool was probably one of those things where I heard about a cat who fell in a pool at some point and thought it was a good idea just in case it ever happened again. But we also had the question about how much money are you willing to spend if your animal needs emergency care? And I, looking back at that now, think about my own animals, and you never know how much something's going to cost and how much you're willing to spend, because you may be able to spend a lot of money and save an animal, or you may have an animal that you spend a lot of money and it's not going to have a good prognosis. So we had all of these things in the way, and I felt like I was trying to have some sort of crystal ball to determine whether this was going to be the perfect home forever. And in reality, it was more about me wanting to have control and trying to ensure that nothing bad was going to happen, which is kind of crazy to think about.
That, like, oof, that's hard. Like, self-recognizing that you want to have that control. Like, that's not an easy, that takes a lot of emotional maturity to be able to recognize that and admit it. So thank you for sharing that. But it's true. I think it goes back to that idea of, once an animal comes into our care, because we've seen those worst case scenarios, we want so desperately to prevent any sort of chance that this animal could happen, that situation could happen to the animal that's our responsibility and in our care, that we want to control their life. And I get it. Like, I'm a parent, I have a human child in addition to my pets. So I understand the need to want to control her future and what she's exposed to. So yeah, I think that was a really good realization. And I honestly had not heard the pool one before. I've seen some pretty crazy applications, but I've not seen the pool question. So that was a first for me. So when you had that application, you squeezed into a 1-page front and back. What did that do for the cats in your care? Did that offer some blanket of protection, or did it help you actually adopt cats, or what were the consequences of that?
So what happened from that was the cats who had the behavior issues that didn't like other cats and needed to go to an only cat home stayed in our sanctuary in rooms with 10 plus cats. And somehow that was better for those cats. And we had cats that had medical issues that spent their entire lives in our sanctuary, where they would live their whole life. They were never euthanized for space, but they lived their whole life in a sanctuary, which is not a home, and never got adopted. And it wasn't because people weren't interested. I hear that a lot with special needs animals. Nobody wants them. We had applications every week on animals, but I never felt that they were good enough for this specific animal, and that somehow they couldn't possibly understand what they're getting into. So if somebody wanted to adopt an FELV cat, thinking, no, but you don't realize they're going to have a shorter life than your normal cat. And somehow I was going to protect them as well as the animal from whatever was going on, and just not trusting them. So few of our cats got adopted. We did not do very many, maybe 60 a year, which would have been a really impressive year. But it also meant that we always had a full house, and we were never able to go out and help other shelters with those special needs cats that were not getting out.
Like, I can just imagine all the shelters I've worked with and organizations I've worked for, like, turning away FELV positive adopters, like adopters that want to take home feeling leukemia positive cats, or even FIV positive cats, which is, you know, very different from an FIV negative cat. But just like, it's hard. Like, I'm sure that's hard for you now to recognize, because you see those cats that are at risk, that need those special homes, and the fact that there were families willing to raise their hand and they weren't allowed to is hard. You know, that's unfortunate. And it takes recognizing that to be able to welcome those families back, for sure.
Yeah.
So you said you had left that role and then landed with Best Friends. So in your first role with us, what was like the first thing that floored you that we were doing differently than what you were doing with the cat organization prior?
So I remember that very early with Best Friends, we were doing an adoption event in LA for Best Friends animals that were coming out of the shelter. And I remember us having discussions about how we were not going to do home checks, those home deliveries that I called them, but home checks, which at the time was still a fairly new concept for Best Friends as well. But I can almost guarantee that I audibly gasped when I heard that, and maybe had a little bit of a panic attack thinking about just giving these animals to people without checking on anything. But my team was really good about just sitting through and talking through everybody's concerns. And I remember specifically that someone said to me, out of all of the time that you've been doing these home deliveries, people get through your application and then you actually take the animal to their house. Have you never had a return or something bad that happened? And I was like, well, no, we've had returns. And, you know, we had a cat get killed by the house's dog, you know, like we've had horrible situations happen from time to time, no matter how much I did. And they said to me, if people are choosing to look at a rescue animal, why would you want to make it harder to support that choice? And I think that really struck me of like, no matter what I did, it wasn't necessarily helping the animal. It was just making it harder for someone who wanted to help them. So that was the beginning of my shift of where I really needed to look at myself and say, why am I doing this?
And it's like, to your point about returns, like they are going to happen, period. You know, returns will happen. It is what it is. We all know, and this is such an argument for not doing behavioral assessments, we all know how an individual responds in each home and in the shelter environment is going to be completely different. And we can't predict that. And so returns shouldn't be something that we're fearful of. We as an industry should focus on supporting pets once they're with their new families, and what resources can we provide to that family to make that a successful match. And if it's not, that's okay. Let's help them rehome, or let's rehome that pet and try a new family. So I can see where it would be a stark contrast going from the rigorous process that you had before to one that wasn't doing home visits. So yeah, I'm glad that you were able to be exposed to that, at least somewhat in baby steps, even though it seems like it was pretty shocking. So you've moved now into different roles with Best Friends, and your work now allows you to be working kind of side by side with shelter staff and out in the community doing our community cat program work. So do you have any favorite stories or examples that you've seen doing that work that have just further pushed you to self-recognize where you had been putting up barriers or judgments before?
Yeah, and every day that I work with my teams and with the shelters and the people in the community, I am humbled and have to remind myself that there are biases that I have and that there are things that I did for 20 years that I probably shouldn't have done, but they just kind of sneak back in. And so we had this one location for a program that's out in the Coachella Valley in California. So it's the desert, basically, very rural, very high poverty level. And we had been told by a local shelters volunteer that there was a specific community that was very dangerous, and that nobody there liked the animals, the cats that were living there. And that if we found any friendly cats when we were sneaking around outside the community in the middle of the night trying to trap the cats, that we should pull the friendly cats and put them up for adoption to someone who cared more. And a little voice inside my head said, oh, we need to save these animals. However, when we actually got into that community and started talking to the people instead of sneaking around in the dark, we found something completely different. It was definitely a community that I wouldn't want to live in, very obviously somewhere I wouldn't want to live. But the people who lived there had a very strong sense of community, and they really loved the cats. The reason the cats were there was because the people loved them. And these rescuers were luring the cats outside of the community to go for this TNR program instead of actually working in the community. And while we were there and we were telling them about TNR and what we were going to offer them, there was a little boy who was just in tears because he thought that his favorite cat, who'd been following us around the whole time, was not going to come back because other cats that he had liked that lived in the community had not come back. They just left, which were picked up by this rescuer and taken for adoption to, someone who quote unquote cared more. And we told him, the cat's going to be back. It'll be great. We'll let you know. And when we came back with his cat, the look on his face was just amazing. He had the biggest grin. He was so excited to have his cat back. And it broke my heart to think a little bit that he was connecting us to these people who would steal his cat from him, when he's 100% accurate in thinking that crossed my mind, because it did. And so me having to check myself and say, why was it that I felt like I should take a cat from a community that loves him just because it's somewhere I wouldn't want to live, when this cat is clearly well loved, he is cared for, he's happy, and it's his home. And taking him and putting him in a shelter or a rescue or even my own personal home would not have been an ideal situation for him. And it would have sent a message to this child that he wasn't good enough or worthy of having an animal that he had bonded to. And so I always think about him and the other kids that we've come across and the other people who really care about the animals in these communities, and try to figure out the best way to support those caregivers instead of just thinking, oh, I need to go in and save this cat.
Yeah, that's a really powerful story. I had a similar experience when I was in Texas, and it was like one of those times that just like really sticks with you. One of the roles I had when I was there had me in the community a lot, doing several different things, and working in those classic low income, low access neighborhoods that, to your point, people would deem as unsafe and that you shouldn't go in there and always go during the day, that sort of scenario. And I often found that when I was there working with people, I always had positive interactions. Like, people are people, right? Regardless of their socioeconomic status, people are people and they're humans, and we're inherently kind. And one of the times, it was an evening, and I had a truck full of dogs that I had picked up in the morning, brought to the shelter as part of our program to provide sterilization, vaccine, and microchipping services. And then at the end of the day, I would go drive them home. And so it was my first stop that night, dropping everyone off, and I dropped 2 dogs off to this woman. One was hers and one was her neighbor's. And she was waiting, I could tell she was waiting outside. So like the second I pull up, and I'm in an ACO truck, I'm working for the municipal shelter at the time. She's like waiting outside. She like runs right over, super excited. We open the doors, we get the dogs out, and she just starts crying and thanking me profusely She at one point invited me in for dinner, which I should have said yes. I had more dogs on the truck. I had to keep going, but she just kept saying, "You saved my dog," and like she said it like 5 times before it actually clicked. Like my initial reaction was, "Oh, she's grateful for these no-cost services. She's grateful that we were able to vaccinate, microchip, and sterilize her dog for her." And then I realized she's saying I saved her dog because I pulled up in an animal control officer truck and I gave her dogs back. Sorry, this was like 7 years ago. I shouldn't be emotional right now. The fact that in this community, we as the government shelter was viewed as the agency that told families they weren't good enough to have pets because maybe they couldn't afford to come into compliance and get a rabies vaccine, or maybe there was a hole in the fence and their dog got out a lot. It was a powerful moment. Like I think back, Stacy, to you saying no one likes to be wrong. Well, of course no one likes to be wrong. But in that moment, I had realized how in so many different roles with so many different organizations before that moment in my life, I had been wrong in a way that was costing cats and dogs their lives and hurting families that care and love for these pets the same way that anyone else would. And it was almost like a suffocating feeling of guilt, which isn't easy. I mean, it's not easy, I think, for any of us. And that's why these self-awareness changes are so challenging, because part of what comes with that is taking responsibility for being wrong historically. And that's okay. Like, we're okay to be wrong. Someone once said to me, change is the only constant. And like, it's so true, right? Like, you have to keep changing, and to keep changing, you have to recognize that how you're doing it today or how you did it yesterday probably wasn't right, or it certainly isn't right any longer. So to think that not only would I never would have in previous roles adopted this dog to this family, I probably would have taken this dog away from this family. And it's just terribly tragic, because she cared so deeply for her pets, no different than how I care for a Pablo running around in the background there. And so and it's just when you have those direct connections with the people and families and homes and neighborhoods that you may deem as not where you want to send your pets, you understand that's exactly where you want to send your pets, and that those families are just as good as any other family, regardless of whether or not they have the ability to have a relationship with a veterinarian, regardless of whether or not they have the nicest home or the safest home in terms of what you would consider safe in your mind. So for me, and it sounds like for your story, getting out and interacting with those communities and those families and understanding that they love pets the same way that you and I do, I think it was a powerful thing, at least for me, and helping push along that kind of self-awareness journey. And I think we do have a picture. I think you took a picture of that little boy, so we'll share it. It's super cute. Thank you, Destiney.
Thank you.
So Kristan, moving on, I'm going to ask you kind of that same question that we asked Stacy and Destiney. So how did you land here? How did you end up in companion animal welfare?
Yeah, so it was about 10 years ago. I was at a crossroads. I had just graduated from college and I was deciding how to move forward with career, as one does when you're in your 20s and a little lost. So I had been always passionate about animal issues, whether it was wildlife and conservation issues or companion animal welfare issues. But I wasn't really sure how to get into either of those fields. And during college, I had actually studied abroad in Costa Rica. I did like a primate behavior and research course, but I didn't think I wanted to go the research route. Like I wanted something that had more impact. So I pursued 2 internships actually that year after I graduated. The first one being focused on endangered shorebird conservation and resource management at a national recreation area. So similar along the lines of research, but still having some hands-on work in the field. And then my second internship was actually at the Best Friends Animal Sanctuary. And the work that Best Friends was doing at the sanctuary and even nationally through all the programs like really spoke to me. I'd always been passionate about the human-animal bond, and I didn't realize I could really make a career through animal welfare. So that really sold me, and I wanted in, and I haven't looked back since then. And that was the way I could really have direct impact for companion animals and families as well.
That's great. I'm a lifer too. I got started in college and never left. So I get it. So after that, after your internship and you kind of realized you wanted to go the lane of companion animals, how did you get into your first position?
Yeah, so after my internship, AKA ran out of funds as an intern, I had to return home and I started seeking out employment from local animal shelters. And actually during this time, my best friend was actually looking to adopt a puppy. Her and her husband, newlyweds, he was in the military. They were about to be relocated overseas to be based in Italy, actually. So they were going around visiting different shelters and checking it out. And unfortunately, when they put in applications, they got denied at a few shelters, actually, because they were moving around too much and they would probably have to return the pet eventually. So they were getting super frustrated and almost considered just going to the local puppy store. And I just encouraged them to keep going and try every shelter. So one of the last places they actually ended up was a small private shelter in our home area. And through that process, yes, there was a traditional application with references, veterinarian check, landlord check, no home visit, but still, checking all those boxes. The adoption coordinator that they worked with really took it to the next level where she had a conversation with them and she met them where they were at and they talked about their situation and they were, through that conversation, actually approved to adopt as opposed to all these references and stuff. And actually through conversations between, my friend and this adoption coordinator, it turns out there was a position opening up at the shelter on their adoptions team. So I ended up applying, interviewing, and that was my first beginner shelter job, I like to call it, where I got to learn a lot about shelter operations, the adoption process, animal care, all of that. And actually, my friends still have that puppy 10 years later, and that puppy has made every move from New York to Italy, back to New York to Texas, and now they have kids and more dogs, and I'm so glad they got the chance to adopt through that one person that really took the time to listen to them, hear them out, and move through that adoption more conversationally as opposed to just, checking the boxes and making sure they were the right fit.
That's such a great story. And I'm sure we all have those, right? We all have family and friends. I can even think recently, one of my sisters who is also a lifer in animal welfare, has worked for several organizations, spent more than a decade with best friends. So when you think about her adoption resume, she's checking all the boxes, right? Career in animal welfare, owns a home, has a fenced yard, has vet care, has references, all of that stuff. Her family lost both of their dogs last year. And then when they went to start looking to adopt, several months later, this past spring, they applied with 3 different organizations, kind of in our local area, downstate Illinois, and were denied by all 3 locations. One for having, I have a 5-year-old nephew, so for having a son, having a child that was a minor, under 18, not a teenager even. And then one for being too far away. So they lived 50 miles from the home base of this rescue organization. And so automatically denying this family. And yeah, I think my sister is a great family and a great home for all of her pets. And seeing that is unfortunate. They were able to connect with a brick and mortar shelter a little bit north of us that didn't have any of those barriers. And now they have Eleanor, who's a great dog for their family. But to hear about your friend's story where, again, those organizations judged that family without even getting to know them. And here they have internationally moved with that dog and 10 years later still have it. And so I think that's a great thing for us all to think about when we're looking at our adoption process. What we learn on paper isn't going to tell us something about someone's family. We have to meet people where they're at. We have to have face-to-face conversations or virtual conversations in the time of COVID to be able to really learn and match that family with the right pet for them. So you're working at this new shelter. You're starting to learn more about operations. Is everyone kind of doing stuff the same way there?
So it was interesting. Some people were doing some things a little differently, and there was staff that I saw and while I was training there, that want to check all the boxes, make sure we're doing everything. It's all black and white, and screening people to make sure they were good homes for these pets that we had that were homeless. And seeing the other side of it, actually the person who trained me and that set up my friend with the puppy finally, she really just took that conversation based and moved through it as a matchmaking process, as opposed to, you know, checking all the boxes and just being really rigid like some staff were doing. So I was really interested to see both sides. So I kind of like rode down the middle of that, because I didn't want to get in trouble for breaking any protocols or anything like that, but realizing that we have pets that we can move pretty quick through the shelter and save more pets. We were a limited admission, you know, private shelter. So how can we help more of our local municipals quicker? And, you know, out of state, obviously, I'm in the Northeast, I'm in New York. So obviously there's states down south that need a lot of help. So how can we move quicker? And seeing her in action, you know, really helped me understand that and just shadow her and stuff like that. But it wasn't until actually I attended the Best Friends National Conference that everything like super clicked for me, that I saw like the bigger picture. You know, I saw what other organizations were doing, and I attended one of the adoption sessions, and really saw how the application process was putting in a lot of barriers to getting the animals out quicker into homes so we can then rescue more animals. So I returned back, you know, to work super energized and like jazzed up, wanting to make a bunch of changes. But unfortunately, I just wasn't able to get approval, you know, from leadership or, you know, colleagues. It was still like everyone was, you know, making decisions based off of fears and the what ifs. So I did get to a point where, you know, I wanted to gain additional, you know, experience and other opportunities. So I did learn a lot there, and I'm so grateful for my time there and all my past colleagues, but I did end up looking for other opportunities in the end.
So did you move to a new organization?
Yes. So in looking for a new experience, I left for a larger organization for a position actually that was more focused on transport and community events. And I learned so much there too, just around transports and all of that stuff. I didn't have a direct line to adoptions, but I did get to look at, you know, from the outside in, and their process made me kind of uncomfortable too. It was just a ton of barriers and, you know, roadblocks to kind of getting pets into different, you know, homes and communities. So I ended up boomeranging back to my original shelter and working at their low-cost spay-neuter clinic, which was a huge resource to the local community that the shelter was, the area that was in.
That's great, thank you. So fast forward a little bit, you land in your first role of Best Friends. And as I said in the intro, you've worn several hats with us in the organization. So you have a good idea of all of our programs, but kind of thinking of the different roles you've played in the work that you've done, have you had more aha moments? Like more times where you've really realized, wow, I need to broaden my perspective on that.
Yeah, for sure. So after my little gig at the spay-neuter clinic, I landed a position at Best Friends and originally started it with our New York City program. And that was pre the time that there was a life-saving center there. So we literally built that program from the ground up, completely foster-based. So just again, that aha moment for me was really embracing the community. To be a partner in that life-saving. We literally needed them to be able to pull, you know, animals from the local shelters to get them into foster and then find homes for them. And then most recently through my embed mentorship kind of support roles that I've been in most recently, specifically working in shelters in South Texas and the Texas area in general, you know, looping back to the community cats that, you know, Destiney was just speaking about and you were speaking about. There were just so many cats coming into the shelter and not making it out alive, unfortunately. So we really needed to take a look at returning more than just the feral cats, you know, returning the friendlies as well. And, you know, in those communities in Texas, there's just a different culture, I think, around cats being in the neighborhoods, like Destiny was speaking of as well. I feel like in the Northeast, I don't want to speak for everyone, but as soon as like somebody has a cat in the yard, they're calling you up. Hey, can you take this cat? It's in my yard. It's not supposed to be here. So, you know, it was just kind of an aha moment for me that just different culture around cats in different regions and different areas. And when we started offering those services, you know, a community cat type program, you know, people were really thrilled when their cats came back all of a sudden vaccinated, healthier than before, spay neutered. And, you know, those reunions that I heard about and saw pictures and stuff like that. And I don't know, again, what drives me is the human animal bond. So hearing about that was just like the cats, they're okay outside. And it was something I really had to wrap my head around, just coming again from the Northeast where, you don't see, cats too much in different areas out in the neighborhood sometimes. So, and that's how cats are leaving alive, in those shelters that see that high volume. And it's okay. If they're fat and healthy and doing well out there and they're happy, like, let's get them back to their neighborhoods and, get them, back with their families that were taking care of them.
That's so true. And Destiney, were you the one that was telling me that we done some research on that we're quite frankly stealing people's indoor, outdoor cats, and that if we just leave them where they're at, they're more likely to go home? Were you sharing that?
Yeah, and that was definitely one of my ahas. It's a little bit of an old study now, though it's still very pertinent. But at the time when I read it, it was very new, and I believe it was 13 times more likely for a cat to find his own way home if you leave him where he is. And that I believe it's 60% of the way people find their pets is it just came home. So not any other way other than just leave the cat where he is, as long as it looks like he's doing okay. Otherwise, you're stealing people's pets, very likely, and they don't know where to look for them or when or how to look for them. By the time people realize their pet is missing, especially a cat who's indoor outdoor, by the time people realize that he's not just gone for a few days like he normally is and comes back, he's out of time at the shelter and probably not there. So yeah, that was definitely, when I read that, one of the things where a light bulb went on in my head, and I thought about how many cats have been picked up and taken away from their homes.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you said that, Destiney, because even for me, like thinking about growing up, my family wasn't educated on good pet ownership, and we had cats growing up that were indoor, outdoor, weren't always up to date on vaccines, but we loved our cats and they lived long lives. They were just indoor, outdoor, and my brother just lost his cat. I had my cat growing up, my brother had his cat growing up, and he just lost his cat last year, and he lived to 20. And my brother, moving around as a young adult, like took the cat with him everywhere, and he was always an indoor, outdoor cat, and it was his son, we called him. So, and to think if somebody picked him up and brought him to the shelter, that would have been devastating to my brother. So yeah, that really resonates with me.
And I think we're thankfully in an era of social media where we're hopefully starting to see less of that, where we're getting neighbors that are doing things like taking pictures and posting to Nextdoor or neighborhood Facebook groups, or even knocking on doors or texting friends. Like if we just leave them be, they'll be okay and they'll go home. And I think that applies to dogs a lot too. It's not something that is exclusive to cats. Like I know we've got a neighbor down the street and one of their dogs gets out probably at least once a week, but like we all know it now. So we're like, okay, Molly, go home, so it works out well. But thank you for sharing that. We are getting close to time and we're having some questions come in from the audience. But before we get to those, I want to ask all of you guys just kind of what has been the most challenging thing that you have faced in kind of your personal self-awareness journey? And we'll just go in order. So Stacy, I'll start with you.
Once I found the mute button, I really think the hardest part of it was really seeing your own biases. Because while I talked about realizing that I was also wrong, part of as we changed our adoption policies, we were saving more animals, but we were still looking at things through a lens of certain people coming in to look for a pet. We thought, I don't know about that. And I think really learning to kind of like in Destiney's story, look at families individually and realizing that pets might look differently for everybody, and just learning to stop that negative thought process, because it's really hard if you're working on the front lines of a shelter and you see people coming in to reclaim their pet or coming in to adopt and maybe don't have the best pet history, to not start that negative thought in your head of what type of pet owner you think someone should be. And I think that's still, it's a daily process of looking. Even now when I read through stories on social media of animals that are coming into shelters, it's really trying to look at it through that positive lens of trusting people and trusting that communities and families all love their pets.
Thank you, that's so important. And like you said, still so challenging for us to continue to do on a daily basis. Destiney?
So I think that we you know, I've established that it's hard to admit that you're wrong, but it's also hard that once you admit that you're wrong, to accept that even with the best of intentions that you had at that time, that whatever it was that you were doing, whether directly or indirectly, it affected the animals and potentially in a negative way. I know that now looking back, right, the things that I was doing kept animals from being adopted. It also took animals from homes that were perfectly happy, that they never knew where their animal went. It just disappeared one night and ended up in my shelter or my sanctuary where they weren't ever going to find them. And then by doing those two things as well, I impacted cats in the shelter that I didn't even get a chance to know. And they more than likely were euthanized at the shelter because of it. So just accepting that those were things that happened and continuing to think of how do I make sure that I address that in the future with the policies and the positions that I have going forward.
Very true. Thank you. Kristan?
Yeah, so I definitely relate to, you know, checking your biases and trying to keep an open mind for sure. But then once you get there, you've checked yourself, just not being in a position to be able to actually create change at the organization that you're working at, you know, being in like a middle management position, and not getting that buy-in from others, or your leadership to make changes and remove those roadblocks. So that's been a challenge for me in the past for sure. And, you know, again, a lot of those decisions were being made based out of fear and not looking at data or case studies or research or anything like that. So kind of like realizing when you've hit your limit or you've kind of gone as far as you can, but then recognizing that, you know, it might be time to move on so you still have more impact. And, you know, before reaching that burnout status where you're just totally fried and you can't make any more moves or anything like that. You're just like running in a hamster wheel. Like, so just having that self-awareness and keeping your journey going has been kind of big for me.
No, that's so true. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to pull over some of our audience questions here to my right screen. Okay, so let's see here. All right, so this question here, I will shoot this one to you, Stacy, first, and then Destiney and Kristan, please chime in if you want to as well. But the question is around wanting to make sure that an animal finds itself in a positive home situation. So thinking about dogs more than cats per se, just based on their emotional needs, but really anyone. Aren't things like landlord checks a good thing to have in place to make sure your pet's going to a good home where they're not going to get kicked out?
Yeah, I think there's ways. I will say we were in a college community, so when we looked at eliminating landlord checks, we did keep a list of pet policies for the big companies that we knew were doing that. So that if a student came in and was looking to adopt and they were looking at a husky and they were moving into an apartment complex that wouldn't allow huskies, we would tell them, you know, likely you're not going to be able to keep this pet where you're living. Why don't we find you a dog that fits within what this particular apartment complex has? But what we saw was as we removed those barriers, particularly the landlord check, we got no more returns for landlords than what we had when we were calling landlords. It didn't increase it. We just reminded people to make sure they had checked on their pet rules, where they were living. And, you know, we had to really come at it from a point of trust that if people were coming to the shelter to adopt, they were coming from a good place and they wanted to help a pet get a home. So we just needed to help them match up with that pet that was going to be the right one for their home.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. Are there situations where you would refuse an adoption which are not based on adopter and pet mismatch? Ooh, that's a great question. So really anyone can jump in with that one. And I think the idea behind it is, would you deny someone for any reason other than that pet just not being a good fit? I can't really think of one. I don't know if any of you guys can.
I can give one example. which is kind of the example if we say we're often looking at that one negative example to set all of our policies. We had a family come in, they had several small children. They were all in like Dockers and polo shirts, matching little blonde children. And we started talking to them about what kind of dog they looked for. And they said, well, we believe that dogs should be chained in the barn. And that's where we're gonna keep it, is chained to our barn. And obviously chaining it 24 hours a day in a barn was not something we were gonna do. So we denied them outright. They were very angry. But I think there's always those one-off situations, but that's really the rarity. I mean, I would say I've been witness to thousands of adoptions, and they're the only family who told us that dogs were meant to be chained in barns since the dawn of time. So I think, it's looking at those one-offs that you're gonna have to deny for, but it's gonna be a really rare situation.
Yeah, and I like that you've explained that, because yes, I think there's a stark difference between chaining dogs in a barn 24/7 and responsible tethering that can be a real solution for some families. So it's good to acknowledge those differences. And that is a good example. Thank you. All right, another question here. And gosh, darn, we are getting to the end of our time here. I'll try to get a couple more in. So, and I'll read out loud, and then we can have someone grab it. How do you help teams get over the guilt that you could have saved more lives by doing things differently? In some ways, it's easier for an individual to have an aha self-awareness moment and move forward, but how do you get the team to buy in who may not have had their own personal aha? That's a tough one. I might take a little stab at it first, because this is something I have experienced, obviously, both in my own journey and then implementing with my teams. And for me, I think the biggest part of life-saving change management is exactly what this question is centered on. And so when you're working with a team, and I've been a euthanasia technician. I spent several years literally euthanizing neonatal kittens and pit bull terrier-like dogs for my job, and I thought that I was saving the world, right? Because I worked at the Humane Society and we were making the right decisions. And when I learned that those were the wrong decisions, it was really hard to understand that. So when you're approaching a team about a programmatic life-saving change, you have to keep that in the back of the mind. You're telling this team quite literally that the way they have operated, in some cases for decades, has been wrong, and that countless animals have unnecessarily lost their life as a result of that. So you have to understand that you're about to force that team into a really powerful self-awareness transformation. And you have to be delicate about that. So for me, it's always personal storytelling, doing small group conversations, talking about programmatic change in a way that doesn't flat out say what you were doing historically was bad. It's just offering a new opportunity. So yes, this is how we did things before. Here's a new way that we can try that might end up being easier for everyone. I've had the privilege of working with several different individuals across several different organizations that have been in animal welfare for decades, and that are kind, good-hearted people that would never end the life of an animal if they didn't have to. And so by allowing them access to information and new programming, you're allowing them the ability to do what they really want to do and save lives. Does anyone else want to add to that one? Because it's a good one. It's a good question.
I'll just say, as we came back from the conference, we knew like our next step, because we were committed to changing things, was to get the team on board. So we did a whole staff presentation trying to bring kind of that magic you get if you've ever been to the Best Friend Sanctuary, of that anything's possible when you're there, back to the staff. But we really focused on, what we want to do is save more animals. We want to move forward from this point, figure out how we can save as many lives as possible. And we need you to get on the bus with us and really embrace this new idea. And what we realized was kind of what Bethany was saying, was that despite the past of anybody might have had, and some of our staff had been there since the early 80s, that they didn't want to be ending pets' lives for what they were doing every day. They thought that was the only option. And once they saw that there was another option out there to really make a difference and not have to do that every day, they were completely on board with moving forward and figuring out how we were going to save more animals.
That's great. We are at the close of our time, ladies. Thank you so much. We have several questions that we weren't able to get to. Don't worry, we're going to keep a record of these. This again is the first of a 3-part town hall series. Join us next week. McKenna Yarborough is going to have a phenomenal organizational panel that talks about this transformational change. And then on the 27th, it is really an open discussion. So bring these questions back, bring new questions. We're not going to have anything that's a pre-set out discussion. It's really all about the audience. No question is off limits. We understand that this sort of self-awareness and change is really, really challenging. And we want this town hall to be a safe place for that discussion. So please come back and join us. If you're registered for tonight, we've automatically got you registered the next 2 weeks. Stacy, Destiney, Kristan, thank you ladies so much for offering your insights this evening. They're really invaluable. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, bye.